So we'll be looking at chapter 7 from Maurizio. This deals with Hermes, a little bit on Hestia, but mainly Hermes. So there we have our breakdown. Going to move on. So in the history section, the Maurizio mentions two scholars, a guy named Walter Otto and a guy named Paul Vernant. Otto made the claim, he wrote a work called The Olympian Gods, and it's not a very big work. It's a pretty short work. Given classical scholarship, some can be quite thick. He claimed that each of the Homeric gods had a singularity, sort of a thing that they were known for, right? So a single quality. And for Otto, joy was Hermes' singular quality. So like another god might have distance or might have some other thing, but Hermes, it's joy. And he is a pretty happy-go-lucky god relative to the other gods. He's depicted largely as a teenager, and he has that sort of like ebullience and joy. Now, Hermes Hills, these are actually something called Hermae, Hermae. Hermae are piles of pebbles or stones, little stones, that would be set down or thrown down at crossroads. So as people were traveling, they would take a pebble and they would put it on this pile at the crossroads, and they would make a wish before heading on. And the word Hermae appears to mean just this pile of pebbles. Sometimes that gets translated in works as Hermes Hills. In the Odyssey, one of the servants makes a reference to one of these piles on the way to the palace. There's a crossroads, and there's one of these. Now, what finally happens with these Hermae is that they become Herms, and Herms were a block of stone on top of which there was a head, and on the front of which there was an erect phallus. Right. So that's Herms seem to come from these Hermes Hills, and then of course they're also then associated with Hermes. Now, Hermes may very well have originated as the god who protects travelers at these roads, at these crossroads, and therefore the name Hermes might very well be directly connected to the word Herma, meaning this pile of pebbles. Above all else, Hermes is a travel god. He is the patron of travelers, and that means that extends to communication, that extends to business. Right, those are travel things. It also then extends even to highwaymen, people who rob people out in the boonies, which of course would be a pretty profitable thing. I mean, if you like in old westerns, stagecoaches and other people are often being attacked, far out from the town. Well, the reason for that is if you rob someone and take their stuff, so a stagecoach is coming through and you rob the whatever the people have, and maybe there's some money for the bank, and you get that strong box of money. By the time people can get to town to tell the sheriff so that a posse can be made, you're miles away, right? So it is sort of a way. I mean, it is why highwaymen became such a big deal because they could really strike often with impunity. Um, Hermes is depicted as the messenger god, and he would travel from to and from Olympus and to Earth. He is one of the gods who's generally, thought of as being sort of, he hangs around with humans a fair amount. When Zeus goes on a recon mission disguised as a mortal, often Hermes is with him. He wears characteristic travel garb. He's got this wide-brimmed hat. It's called a petasus. He's got the winged boots, which are called the petasus. And then he's got the herald's wand, the caduceus, that marks him off as a herald. Real heralds would have such a wand, right? Because heralds, of course, were protected. So if two cities were at war with one another, you still want to keep the line of communications open because one city might decide to surrender. Well, you don't need to continue fighting the war if one side's going to surrender. Or maybe one side will make some sort of offer that will allow the other side to back off and stop the war. So again, you want to keep line of communications open. But that means making sure that any messenger, it doesn't get killed. So that wand would indicate that. Now Hermes, of course, is a god, so he doesn't need that sort of protection. His wand is special because it's got two intertwined snakes with the heads are facing each other on the top. Now in art, in ancient art, which is basically vase paintings, that usually looks like a broken figure eight on top of the stick. He might be wearing a chlamys, which is like a poncho. Now, one of Hermes' cult titles is Ennodius, Hermes of the Road, and Hermes is the the guy who guides Priam, the king of Troy, to Achilles' tent in Book 24 of the Iliad. Because obviously Priam, if he went without the protection, would be captured by the Greeks. Hermes also goes to and from the underworld. The Hermes Hills could serve as grave markers, but since these were mainly at crossroads, what they generally served as is they could serve as mile markers, like how many miles to Athens, that type of thing. Hermes was a god that you would call upon in curse tablets to sort of help, because he's sort of a trickster figure. So there could be a dark side to Hermes, although generally he is sort of an upbeat, optimistic god. He is tangentially connected to the Anthesteria festival, which is a festival in Athens. It was a Dionysiac festival. It was a drinking festival. But as part of this festival, it was thought that the ghosts of the dead would come to the festival, and then when the festival was over, of course, they had to go back to the underworld, and Hermes would be invoked to escort them. And Hermes, as the person who escorts ghosts to the underworld, he is called Psychopompus or Psychopomp, as here, escort of souls. This is a pretty famous lekathos. It's like like an ointment jar. So it's fairly small, of Hermes. And Hermes appears to be running or flying. He is moving in one direction. His head is looking in the other direction, which might indicate that he's done something and he's, basically taken on the lamb, seeing if anyone's following him. He has all the characteristics, right? So he's got the winged sandals. You can see those. He's got the caduceus, which, as I said, looks like a broken figure eight on top of the stick. He's got the hat. Now, the hat is actually that disc that appears to have been like it blown off his head, but that's the wide-brimmed hat. And the triangle there within that circle might very well be the strings to hold the hat, like around the neck or on top of the head. And he's got the chlamys. That's what a chlamys is, that poncho thing he's wearing. Hermes here is shown bearded. He is often shown as a beardless youth, but not in this. In the vase paintings, he seems to have a beard a lot of the time. The Herms, these boundary markers originally in the countryside, maybe coming out of the Herms, so the Hermi, but they were then taken into the city and they were served. They were served as sort of fertility figures, sort of like garden gnomes, but they represent for fertility of the garden. But they also serve as apotropaic figures. So you've got this figure with the phallus representing fertility, but it also is a way, as for us, right? If you flip the bird at someone, right, which is basically you're making a phallus symbol at them, you're basically telling them to F off. And that it may also be what these figures were seen as. So Hermes' fertility was associated with livestock, not so much human fertility. He is a god of luck and lucky finds, not Lucy finds as it says here, but lucky finds. Windfalls were generally thought to be something that you would get from Hermes. So he'd be a god of gambling, among other things. The phallus is in front of the Herm would also be apotropaic. It's basically telling people this is private property, F off. The Pan, the son of Hermes, is shown as having a goat's head, and he always has an erect phallus. And the interesting thing about Hermes is he's sort of an in-between god. And so, like, one of his kids is an in-between figure. He's part animal and part human, which is unusual for Greek gods. It's pretty common for Egyptian gods, right? They have an animal head, but otherwise they're human. But Greek gods, there aren't too many, but Pan is one of those, and he happens to be Hermes' son, who's this in-between god. And the story of the Pan is told that there's a Homeric hymn to Pan that tells the story, and in it, Hermes is proud of his kid. Now, when the kid's born, mom freaks out, basically loses her mind. But Hermes is like the proud papa, and he's showing off his kid. So, which is actually sort of sweet. Now, one thing that happened in Athens, and I think it happened actually in 416 BCE and not 415 BCE, but is the mutilation of the Herms in Athens. Now, this by itself might not seem like such a big deal. One night in Athens, some group of hooligans went around Athens and basically knocked the phallus off these Herms. So they were mutilated. That could be seen as a bad omen, because these are figures that represent fertility. They represent success. They also serve as sort of a protective force. So if those are all knocked off, that could actually cause people to sort of freak out. The important thing is that Athens was in the middle of a war with Sparta called the Peloponnesian War. It has started in 431, ended in 404, so we're right sort of in the middle of that war. Athens, at this point, might be a little bit up over Sparta as far as how the war is going. Athens plans to launch a major expedition against the island of Sicily, and specifically the city of Syracuse in Sicily. Now, why are they doing this? Because Syracuse and Sicily as a whole is allied to Sparta. Now, the reason this is important is Sicily is a very fertile island, and the grain and other crops that are grown on Sicily could feed the entire Spartan, people. So this is a great food supply for Sparta during this war. Athens decides they're going to basically take over that, and they launch this expedition. The guy who's going to lead the expedition is a man named Alcibiades. And I often compare Alcibiades to maybe Bill Clinton. He's sort of like a wild guy, but he's very smart. And he probably was the best general that Athens had at this point. It was his plan to invade Sicily, and with him at the head, the likelihood is very high that Athens would have won. But as I said, he was a wild guy, and a word got around that he was involved in the mutilation of Hermes. We don't know whether he was or not, but he was going to be brought up on charges. The decision to bring him up on charges, they decided to take that action after he already left with the Athenian fleet for Syracuse. Well, he got word they were going to do that, and so when he got out of Athenian-controlled waters, the ship he was on, he took it and he sailed directly to the Spartan forces on Sicily, and basically joined them. So he switched sides, because either he did do what was said and he would be severely punished in Athens, or he didn't, but because people were jealous of him, he likely would have been found guilty. In other words, he would probably not have been able to get a fully fair trial if he was not guilty, and he may very well have been guilty. Whatever the reason is, the guy who comes up with the plan now joins the other side. The general that the Athenians send to take over is a guy named Nicias. Nicias is an Athenian. He's a good enough general, but he was opposed to the war from the very beginning. He's a very conservative politician. He doesn't like the idea of the expedition. And so his heart's not in it. The guy who was in charge of the original plan is now on the Spartan side, and Athens is in Sicily for 2 years. They ultimately lose because of the combination of factors. A somewhat weaker general instead of Alcibiades, a guy who doesn't have his heart into it, as opposed to a guy who is now full-fledged on the Spartan side. This does not cause Athens to lose the war, but it is often seen as a turning point in the war. Athens recovers from this, but they lost a lot of men. They spent a ton of money. They probably spent more money on this expedition than they did in the rest of the war. So and it was a failure. So that was basically money lost. So all of that stuff really hurt Athens, and probably Athens would never fully recover from that. So even though they did, come back like 410, they're doing okay, and they're doing okay for a while, and then they finally lose in 404. But they're on a downward trend after 415. This, by the way, is what a Herm would look like without the phallus. So this one apparently has a detachable phallus, because there's actually a hole there that you screw the phallus into, which is sort of interesting. I mean, maybe that was a design they came up with after the others had them knocked off, because there they had to carve a whole new Herm. This is a figure of the calf bearer. This is Hermes was seen this way. This image, by the way, of the calf bearer is also the image that it gets used in the New Testament of the Good Shepherd, right? Getting his lost lamb back and carrying it to safety. Hermes is often shown as beardless. He's sort of depicted as a teenager, like a 17 or 18-year-old. Apollo is generally portrayed as more like a 20-year-old, so a little bit older, a little more mature. He, like Apollo, is seen as a sort of a figure that oversees the boundary between adolescence and adulthood. He would, like Apollo, be a god that would oversee athletic contests. in which young men just demonstrate their worthiness to become adults. One ritual for young men in Sparta was to show that they were ready to take on adult responsibility. They would actually be engaged in rustling, and if they successfully were able to rustle some cattle and get away, they would that was seen as a mark in their favor. And Hermes, as you'll see when you read Homeric hymn number 4 to Hermes, Hermes actually does raid Apollo's cattle and takes Apollo's cattle. Now, Jean-Pierre Venant is another scholar. Walter Otto felt that Hermes was all about joy. Hermes, according to Venant, Hermes is a god about movement, about travel. And he bases this on the fact that in Greek art, where all the gods are shown, Hermes is often shown next to Hestia. Well, what's Hestia? Hestia is the goddess of the hearth. She's the goddess of the home. She's the goddess of staying put. And Hermes is the opposite, right? Because things get paired in opposites. And so he is then a god of travel. And he is a god of travel, right? He's the god of messengers. He's the god of businessmen. He's the god of people who use the roads. So he is a guy on the go, or a god on the go. Hestia is a figure that has almost no temples, rituals, or cult shrines. There aren't even very many artworks. I mean, she does appear in groups of all the gods. There's nothing particularly notable about Hestia in art. She's basically shown as a matron, which would ordinarily be a married woman. She's a virgin goddess, but of course she's depicted as older, and so she looks like an older married woman. Her name actually is tied to the Greek word that means hearth, so she really is the goddess of the hearth, which is the fireplace, the center of the home. For the Romans, this becomes central. The temple of Vesta in Rome, Rome was imagined as a big family, and the center of Rome was the temple of Hestia, which was the fireplace sort of for the whole city. So there, Vesta is much more important for the Romans than Hestia is for the Greeks, but she is still seen as sort of the representation of home. She is tied to the interior of the house. So Hestia serves as the starting point of orientation, right? You start at home, but then you go out into the world. And Hermes is the guy who's out in the world, right? Who travels. So here we have a red figure vase showing Hestia. Hestia is seated on a throne, and she's dressed as a married woman. The theory here looks not at structuralism, which we had in chapter 6, but looks at archetypes. And this is a Carl Jung thing. So Carl Jung was a psychoanalyst. He was a student of Freud, and then later he was a competitor of Freud. And he felt that that your mind was sort of programmed. By the time you get to the point where you're starting to realize yourself as an individual, your mind's already been programmed by the environment, by your interaction with your parents, and you sort of intuit and you gather like a basic framework of looking at the world from your society. And this is the collective unconscious. Right, so you don't often verbalize this, but it still has an effect. So within the American sort of psyche, one of the things in the collective unconscious might be things like individual liberty. It might be like in the days before the frontier was closed, the open plains and the land that you could still go to, right? So that the idea of the expansion of America. Throughout the 19th century, that was part of the psyche. So there was always opportunities just around the corner, that sort of thing. And you wouldn't always necessarily verbalize it, but you'd sort of feel it in your bones. And that would affect then how you interact with the world. Now, in addition to that, there were also archetypes. So one archetype, for instance, that Jung talks about is the wise old man or the wise old woman. And those appear in all sorts of literature. If you look at uh, Star Wars, right? Obi-Wan Kenobi in the first Star Wars film is the wise old man who advises the young hero, right, and sets the hero on his path. There's also sort of a clever scoundrel, Han Solo. That would also be an archetype. The trickster is one of those archetypes, and the trickster is the figure that doesn't play by the rules that normal people follow. And Hermes is a trickster figure. Prometheus is a trickster figure. Odysseus is a trickster figure. The persona of a person is the mask they wear in their day-to-day lives. So it's the version of themselves that they present to the world, and that persona is seen by people as being stable. But it really isn't, right? I mean, you act a certain way when you're, in public than you might act privately, right? So the shadow is that sort of dark side of yourself that you do not openly show to the public, but it's still part of you. And the trickster, of course, is more aligned with the shadow figure. Now, where you see a shadow figure work like in the comics, you get the figure of the Hulk, right? Bruce Banner was the persona, the outwardly, and then his sort of deep id monster is the Hulk. Now, the 5 characteristics that William Hines and William Doty, they did a work on tricksters. That is worth considering. I mean, it's a good way to look at it. Now, it's never a good idea to take this stuff as like absolute gospel that always applies. But what they did is they looked at a bunch of trickster stories of different cultures. So they weren't looking just at like European tricksters, but tricksters in various cultures. And they basically said there were 5 characteristics. So tricksters, don't follow the rules often, right? They find their own path, which is outside the normal rules. They will often disrupt things to their own benefit. They can change their form, those sort of things. So there are 5 of these characteristics, and they're worth knowing because I think when you see trickster figures, you'll see, oh yeah, that definitely applies. That definitely applies to that character, or I can see that in them. So I think it helps you get a better appreciation of the figure and why the figure is portrayed the way they are, because tricksters are often portrayed in similar ways. Now, some cultures love tricksters. The Greek culture would be one of them. So Hermes is very much a heroic figure, and except for Hesiod, so is Prometheus. Right? Those figures are actually not seen as villains, but they're seen as actually great guys, and you want them on your side. But Norse culture, the figure of Loki is a much more ambiguous figure. He does good things, but he's also capable of causing unbelievable damage. In fact, he's the one who causes the end of the world. So he's a problematic figure. Henry Louis Gates, the Harvard professor, he wrote a book called The Signifying Monkey, where he looked at the African trickster figure of the monkey. And again, if you think of monkeys, right, they are sort of jokers in the animal world. The selection from Lewis Hyde about the trickster I think is great. And I think what he has to say about Hermes is interesting, because what he says about Hermes is he suggests that Homeric hymn number 4 to Hermes probably was composed in the 7th century, the 600s BCE. At this point, the Greeks are very much engaged in trade, and prior to this, wealth had been determined in terms of land, right? The landed aristocracy. But with the rise of trade, you now have people becoming wealthy because they are merchants. And those merchants are sort of seen as middle class. They're not the aristocracy, but because of their great wealth, they are becoming a new aristocracy. And he argues that Hermes, as the outsider god, he's born in a cave, he's living in a cave, and he decides he wants to be on Mount Olympus. That story was really designed with the rising merchant class in mind, because Hermes, of course, is their god. And I think that's a pretty good argument. I think he makes the argument well. He also tells the story of Frederick Douglass, who is a historical figure. He had been a slave in Maryland. He escaped and then became a leading voice for abolition. But in what way is Frederick Douglass a trickster figure? Well, he's an actual person, so in that sense, he's not just an archetype. But you know, any slave is going to be a trickster figure of a sort, because just to get by, you have to trick master. Just to get by, if you want to escape, you really have to be careful and tricky. And if you do escape, you're stealing your master's property, because you are your master's property, so you're stealing that. Now, he's not arguing that Frederick Douglass is a bad person. Far from it. The system itself is wrong, so the trickster here is actually very much the hero who is fighting against an unjust system. So here we have uh, uh, a mosaic of Hermes Trismegistus, who was he's a mixture of things. He's a mixture of the god Hermes, of the Egyptian god Thoth, and of there apparently was an actual legendary magician named Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great, um, and he is generally depicted as an old man. So if you see artwork that shows Hermes, but Hermes is depicted as an old man, they're thinking of Hermes Trismegistus. So the comparison section compares Hermes with Thoth, a god that the Greeks, that Herodotus, for instance, made the connection between Hermes and Thoth. The Egyptian city of Kmun, which is where the temple of Thoth is, was called by the Greeks Hermopolis, so the city of Hermes. So there's definitely a connection. Um, Over time, this is into the Roman Empire, like 100 A.D. or so, 100 CE. Um, the figure of Hermes and Thoth and Hermes Trismegistus get sort of merged into one. Um, Thoth, his appearance in some art, Thoth appears as a baboon. In other places, he appears as a man, but he's a man with the head of an ibis, a bird. Um, he is associated with cultural activities, with death, with the afterlife. He is seen as sort of an advocate for the dead. And he's connected with the law. So in some ways, he's much more a law-abiding version of Hermes. He's not as much a trickster figure, but he is clever with language. He's the one who supposedly introduces writing to the Egyptians, just like the Greeks claim that Hermes, in some accounts, Prometheus, in other accounts, is the one who taught the Greeks how to write. Neither is true. We know where the Greeks learned to write. They took the Phoenician writing system and then made it their own. So that was done by humans for sure. I mean, we even know roughly when that happened. Sometime between 800 and probably 780 is when they first start to adapt that. So no gods need to be actually introduced. But the story was that it actually went back to mythic times, and that Hermes himself was the one who taught humans, or Prometheus did it. Plutarch tells the story of Osiris, and Thoth aids Osiris in those stories. Here is um, a statue of Thoth, right? So he looks like an Egyptian male, and then the head, of course, is that of an ibis. There is a selection, it's a very short selection from Plato's Dialogue Phaedrus. Plato was a philosopher. He wrote his philosophical works in dialogue form, like little plays. The main character is Socrates in all of these, and there are one or more other characters, and the person that Socrates is talking to, at least the main one he's talking to, gives his name to the title of the work. So Plato's Phaedrus, Socrates' interlocutor is a guy named Phaedrus. And in the selection, we get Socrates talking about how Thuth, the spelling is different in Greek, that Thuth was the inventor of writing for the Egyptians. And according to Socrates, he did the Egyptians no favor. Now, he claimed this was a great invention that would allow for, facts not to fade away. But Socrates said the problem with writing is once you write something down, you can forget it. And that, of course, weakens memory. So for Socrates, it's not a good thing for things to be written down. And Socrates himself did not publish anything. We only know about Socrates because Plato and some other disciples wrote about him. Ptolemy the First was a general of Alexander the Great. When Alexander died, Ptolemy became the ruler of Egypt, and then his successors were all called Ptolemy, and that became really sort of an equivalent to Pharaoh, right? So the leader of Egypt was a Ptolemy. But the first Ptolemy was also called Soter, which means savior, and of course, because he is actually Greek-speaking and is Macedonian, he is going to think of the gods in Greek terms, and so there's going to be a merging of Egyptian and Greek cultural forms. Hermes and Thoth become more aligned with one another. Hermes Trismegistus really is a figure in the 100 or so CE or later. And that figure of Hermes Trismegistus is a human figure, right? There seems to have been a human magician that is then becomes divine, and so it gets associated with both Hermes and Thoth, who were gods from their beginning. The selection is the hymn to Thoth, which is quite nice. The Nachleben or reception section deals with Hermaphroditus in pre-Raphaelite art. So the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, that's what they were called, was a group of artists and authors in Victorian, mid to late Victorian England. So the end of the 19th century is what we're talking about. And in that time period, there seemed to be, Victorian England was very proper. And Victorian England didn't like to talk or think about sex because, that was sort of base. And right, we're rational people and we're trying to be more rational. But there was always this acknowledgement of sexual desire. So you end up with like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a piece written during this time period. And Dr. Jekyll is all about rationality, but deep down there's the figure of Edward Hyde. So yes, outwardly he appears to be this mild-mannered doctor and scientist, but deep down he really is this animalistic Hyde. So that's an important image to sort of keep in mind for this time period. So Hermaphroditus is the son of Hermes and Aphrodite. He is spotted. He's very handsome. Of course, the offspring of those two is going to be pretty good looking. Salmachus is a nymph of a warm spring, a sort of hot spring in Greece. And she decides that she wants Hermaphroditus, and she's going to have him. And so she sort of convinces Hermaphroditus to enter her waters. And when he does so, the warm waters or the hot springs cause his own individuality to sort of melt, and he and Salmachus become one, right? And a hermaphrodite is a figure that has both sexual organs, right? That's the sort of definition. So Ovid tells that story. Ovid's Metamorphoses is all about changes that happen. This, of course, is a change, right? Hermaphroditus is male, but he becomes this male-female hybrid with Salmachus. The pre-Raphaelites were fascinated with the figure of Hermaphroditus. Again, the Victorian culture seems to be split in two. On the one hand, they're all about restraint and stiff upper lip and rationality. On the other hand, there's this like sexual stuff that's bubbling, sometimes really bubbling underneath the surface. And so things like gender definition becomes a lot more amorphous, right? So you can look male, but really have characteristics that are more attributed to women, right? So you could be a soft man and be more woman-like. Or you could be a woman who is fearless and has those characteristics that are generally attributed to men. So this blurring of gender boundaries becomes sort of key, and then this figure of Hermaphroditus is like, becomes a sort of an obsession with the pre-Raphaelites, because, male or female are just conceits, and there is no absolute boundary, and there's this movement back and forth between. The artwork, the work by Edward Burne-Jones does not actually show Hermaphroditus, but it does show a hermaphrodite type of thing. The Tree of Forgiveness involves Phyllis, who is a nymph of the almond tree, I think, and she falls in love with a young man named Demophon, and then she sort of goes after him. And in the piece of art here, the Tree of Forgiveness, what you see is a very aggressive female figure attacking a rather shy, retiring male figure. Right, so the gender roles are reversed. And we have androgyny, right? So the male figure is, clearly male, but has soft features. Aubrey Beardsley's piece is very strange, a hermaphrodite among the roses. So here we've got the Edward Burne-Jones, so you can see Phyllis popping out of the tree there. And I guess those are almond blossoms around him, and you can see like his sort of face is a lot more like and she's very much like sexually aggressive in this scene. One of the things I like about this piece that I just find interesting in painting generally is so much of Renaissance and painting all the way up to the 20th century, if it's a male figure, it's all about hiding the male package. And here, I mean, where does this piece of cloth that has covered up his stuff come from, right? He's not wearing any clothes at all, but magically there happens to be this like little whift of clothes, of really sheer clothing that's wrapped itself somehow right around his stuff. Okay, I find it just bizarre. This is the Aubrey Beardsley. It's a woodcut illustration. It actually comes from the Thomas Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur, an edition that came out in the 19th century. Mallory goes back to the 15th century, but the Morte d'Arthur tells the story of Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and of course ultimately Arthur's death. Um, this is from chapter 14. It's the heading of chapter 14. Chapter 14 has nothing to do with I mean, there are no hermaphrodites that I know of in the story. And there isn't anything in this particular thing about roses, but here we've got a hermaphrodite going through sort of this interlocked thing of roses with very thorny, right? There's a lot of thorns there. I mean, almost like he's basically moving through barbed wire.